And that leads me to introduce our distinguished speaker, Jim Gorman, because he joined the board in 1999 when he won the grand prize and the trip to Ireland. Yeah, so you can see what it can do for you. But he didn't need to, because he's deeply rooted in all things Irish on both sides, the Morays and the Gormans. But he's a fourth generation Burlingtoner, a retired Methodist minister who hasn't really retired. He was up all night helping out at a funeral and ministering. But in his spare time, he has contributed a lot to the festival and helped us out with lectures and so on. And he's very much, very knowledgeable about all things, especially Vermont and Irish, ranging from stone circles to the history of the Irish in Vermont. Anything ancient, he said. And today specifically, he's going to talk about the history of the Burlington Police Department, the Irish Burlington Police Department. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Jim. We're very grateful. And here he is.
Thank you. Well, welcome. I have one quick announcement as well. I always dedicate every speech or every talk or lecture to an individual or organization. This particular talk I'm doing in honor of Monsignor Mc Sweeney, who passed away in the last year, was a stalwart supporter of our Irish Festival, and loved having disagreements with me over tea, and was always a good supporter both with his attendance and with money, and he's very sadly missed. I also need to say I'm not an apologist for the Burlington Police Department. I have no, to use a phrase from this world, no real skin in the game, other than the fact that in the early 1900s, my grandfather was a police officer here. There are a couple of things that I'm going to be having passed around in a minute or two. One is the watch that he received when he retired in 1918, and a bullet or two, one from his revolver, which I still own, and a bullet from a modern weapon. So you can see the difference of what it was like, what they worked with. So I'm going to be reading first from an article that appeared in the Burlington Free Press. There's an officer, Lieutenant Beckworth, who wrote a book about the major crimes in Burlington. And it's a good lead-in for this particular discussion. As Burlington grew into a city out of the wilderness, more citizens meant more opportunities for crime. Horse thefts, murders, and drunken brawls swamped the young and prosperous city. These misdeeds inspired the first officers of what would become the Burlington Police Department. The police department was started in 1865. For the first 60 years, it was a volunteer force in the sense that they were appointed, but they received no salary. What they did receive was a per head arrest. So for every person they arrested, they got a little contribution. Because of that, it was an interesting combination of people. The Irish had a huge influence on it because this was such a booming town. When you look back into the 1800s, we were the third largest lumber port in the United States. With that large lumber port came men who had been in the woods for many, many, many months, who had money, who were strong, and enjoyed a good time. Now, their idea of a good time sometimes was not what was shared by the rest of the citizens of Burlington. Hence, you needed men that were equally as tough. Two officers that I think exemplify that. Part of it, I'm being prejudiced, is my grandfather, and one is Officer Miles. If you notice the Tasmanian devil in the front, I use this as a representation of my grandfather. My grandfather stood 5'7", had a 29-inch waist, and weighed 207 pounds. So he looked somewhat like this. A little later, I'll point him out in the one picture that I have of the Burlington Police Force. One of the reasons that the Irish here and in just about every other town that you are ever going to see went into the police department, the fire department, and politics, where this is what they were greeted as in the early 1900s. They were considered not worthy of hiring. So they took the jobs that nobody else wanted. They also were very prevalent within the railroad. Rutland Railroad pretty much was built by the Irish laborers. You also have the Irish that were in Rutland working with the stone there. Everybody just assumes that the Italians in Barrie also were Italians in Rutland, but it really was the Irish that held the marble industry down there. So this is our next image. This is an application for the office of police officer in the city of Burlington. It happens to be the one that was my grandfather's when he reapplied in 1925 once they started paying a salary. He retired in 1918 because he had 3 children, a house, a wife, and needed a steady income. A couple of interesting things about this. In the time between 1918 and 1925, he gained 1.5 inches in height and lost 32 pounds. And that was because you had to be no more than 175 and no shorter than 5'8". But somehow he got past that. They also, if you notice, will be going on this page, and I know it's a little light. They actually asked you during the application process what political party you belong to. And so you see things have changed slightly in the intervening years. This is the back copy of the same document. It shows that he passed his physical, and he has references. Now in the references we have R.G. Miles, who owned the company. His cousin was the Miles that I'll be referring to later. Loomis of Loomis Street. Edmund Moran, who was a professor at UVM. Frank Brown, who was a business owner. And Roy Lampson, who the only reference I can find to was a laborer. So Grandpa worked his way through. Now this is probably the most famous of the photos that they have of the Burlington Police Department. This is from the 1913. My grandfather is in the back.
What are they standing in front of?
They're standing directly in front of the police department, which is now the Burlington City Arts. So it's right next to City Hall. I brought a pointer, but for some reason it only goes on the black screen. So this is going to be the one time you see me come up and go over here. This is my grandfather, smiling lad that he is. If we look at these officers, all but 3 have Irish names. Those 3 are French Canadian and were part of the Winooski Police Department before they came over to work with us. Now this is another article from the Burlington Free Press. This was produced in the 50th anniversary of 1913, so it was 1963. The upper photograph, the Free Press just can't help but comment on the fact that all but one of the officers had handlebar mustaches. And that was the part of the uniform of the Irish. Once again, out of this list of men, there's only one that is not Irish. Now in the second one, this is 10 years later, you notice that the handlebar mustaches have disappeared. We have our first Irish Mayor Burke, sitting in the front. We have the Captain Barber, who was the police chief in Burlington at that point, and the police chief from Winooski, which was Fisher. As I said, it was a very rough time. This was the primary weapon of the Irish police officer. This was the billy. The Irish called it the Trinity, for it taught truth, honesty, and morality. The gun on the top is the police revolver that my grandfather carried during his tenure for 10 years as a police officer. He was very proud of the fact that he never had to fire it once on duty. In fact, the Irish felt that if you pulled your gun, you were weak. You should have been able to handle it with the billy or your mouth. The weapon below is the type of weapon that would be carried by our modern police. You can see it's slightly bigger. I passed around the two bullets. One is a .32 caliber. That's the one with just a little bit of lead on the top. And the second one is a 9mm, which is the standard round of the police of modern era. Now, no police officer would be worth his salt without a backup. This was the Irishman's backup. This is a sap. Now, what a sap is a wooden handle with a pouch filled with lead shot. And so you would hold it in your hand with the shot over the back of your hand, and you would strike a blow. The wooden handle reinforced your fist, and then whatever the lead would come up and whack them. So they got 2 for 1. Their goal was not to hurt anyone permanently, just to disable them. I'll be reading from a short blurb from the Free Press in 1912. On Sunday last, an officer was called to the saloon. We didn't have bars. We still had saloons in Burlington at that point. Upon the arrival of the officer, he was greeted by one gentleman who was breaking up the premises. This gentleman stood 6'5". When asked by the proprietor where the rest of them were, the comment of the officer was, "One of them, one of me." He promptly walked up and clubbed him, put on the cuffs, went outside. When he found out that it would be a half an hour before the paddy wagon could come, he grabbed the gentleman, unconscious as he was, by the cuffs and dragged him up Main Street to the police station. The next day, since he had no money, he received 30 days for drunken disorderly. Now, this is not something that would occur today by any stretch of the imagination, but it was consummate with what was going on at the time. You had men that were tough, and you needed officers that were just as tough. This is just framework so that you know what the officers were facing. We're now going to be moving on to some of the, a couple quick pictures of what our area looked like at that time. Oops, sorry. As you can see, it was a bustling area. This is the dock area. Within that stretch, there are 5 saloons. This is at the bottom of the ferry dock at King Street. So once again, it was bustling. There was confusion. One of the reasons that officer was so quick in striking a blow was the month before, when he went into that saloon, he was assaulted by the bartender because he was arresting the bartender's son. So he was making sure that there was no quibbling. Now I bring this up because A, it's winter, and it's still winter here even though we haven't seen it. In the early 1900s, we didn't plow snow in Burlington, Vermont, or anywhere in Vermont. We rolled it, so it was compressed. So the Irish saw this as an opportunity. For those of you who are familiar with Maple Street, If you were to start at the top of Maple Street with a sled, you could make it almost to the dock area. So these officers who were receiving no pay only got it per head contributions. On the weekends, would stand along with volunteers from the jail. They felt that they had a debt to society, and they were persuaded to assist them in this project. What they would do is the children would gather at the top of Maple Street. They would stand at each of the intersections. The kids would be allowed to go down on their sleds or whatever else they were sliding on, toboggans, whatever. And if any traffic was coming along, horse-drawn at that point probably, although there were some vehicles, would be stopped by these gentlemen because it was the future of Burlington for them to work with the children. It was their goal. They had taken it on as part of their part and parcel of their service. These are a couple slides that I got from the Vermont Historical Society. I'm sorry, they're a tad blurry, so I'm not going to leave them up very long. But these are slides from Burlington Harbor. The other activity you had during the winter was to skate. We actually had ice that stayed back in the early 1900s. Unfortunately, the one thing that none of the photographs that they sent me had were the barrels. Now, when I was growing up, and I used to skate over across from the boys' club at Roosevelt Field, there was a shed, and there was a little potbelly stove, and three gentlemen smoking cigars the whole time, feeding that potbelly stove, and the smell of wet wool and cigar smoke will always be in my mind. In this case, they had barrels out on the ice that were manned by, once again, citizens that owed a debt to society. Now, the Irish, knowing that they were cold, also included a pint for the boys. And so they did their civic duty. People were allowed to be warm. And once again, the Irish had done something for the city out of the kindness of their heart, not anything that they were going to be paid for. When I was growing up, we had a program called Officer Friendly. Actually, one of our police chiefs, Kevin Scully, once again the Irish, began as Officer Friendly. And this was a person that would go around from school to school and show the good side of the police department, talk about what it was like to be a policeman, talk about the problems that they have. That program has continued now. There are 2 officers that are assigned full-time. I actually stopped by the police department this morning before I came in here. There's 1 full-time officer at the high school by the name of Brian, and then Bailey, a young lady, represents the police department at all the middle schools and elementary schools. And so this program of working with the children of the city has continued from 1902 to this very day. Now, this is a slide of the Morgan House. We actually have a Morgan in the audience today, and she was very kindly provided the picture for me. As I said, the Irish worked their way through the not hiring phase, became part and parcel of the fire department, the police department, and politics. But there are some, through dint of effort, worked through the lumber industry as well. The Morgans made their fortune in lumber. I can remember as a youth entering this house just once, and there was no wood known to man that wasn't in that house somewhere. It was the most gorgeous building you could ever see on the inside. The Morgans continued to this very day. One that I knew quite well, Merv Morgan, actually was in the Guard and made the rank of Major. And so they continued to be successful. But there was a bit of nepotism. And the other bit that I have to to talk about. The Irish took care of the Irish. If you were an Irishman, an O'Toole, an O'Brien, a couple people that I know, who got into a bit of trouble in a saloon, many times you were escorted home. The Morgan children enjoyed their pints, and many a time Officer Miles or Officer Gorman were called to the Morgan household, and she would plead, "What can we do with my dear sons?" And they would educate them. That nepotism continued on past retirement. I can tell you a story of a young man in 1940 who decided that he was an operatic singer and climbed the fire escape outside of the Richardson building, the old Abernathy building at the top of Church Street. He decided he would do this at 2 in the morning. And so Officer Steady, and to this day I knew Steady quite well. I have no idea what his real name is because that was his nickname and that's what they always called him. And that was because he could balance a 10-pound weight at the end of his hand and it would be steady. The last of the really strong Irish. Didn't want to arrest this young man because he was the son of a former police officer and a cook who occasionally gave Steady a free meal. So he went to the restaurant that this young man worked at, got a waitress to come and get him. The waitress convinced him to come downstairs. She convinced him to go home, where his mother promptly put him in the coal bin, and that's where he woke up the next morning. Because of that, he took that young waitress out on a date. A year later, they were married. And 13 years later, I was born. The last act I'm going to talk about the Irish is a part of our past that few people know about. During the 1920s, we were a hotbed for the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan themselves declared that there were 14,000 members within the state of Vermont. From what I've been able to ascertain from records, and the Vermont Historical Society can ascertain, there were really only 2,000 members, primarily within the city of Burlington and in the south of Brattleboro, Bennington, Rutland, that area. The first non-mask, we have a controversy going on now within the city of Burlington about a new ruling that you can't wear a mask in public. The first time that appeared on the books was in 1922, passed in Burlington, just because of these gentlemen here, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this is not actually in Burlington. It's the last known rally that they had in Montpelier in 1927. In 1923 and 1924, they became very active in the Burlington area, with or without masks, burning crosses on the breakwater, burning crosses on the lawn. And they burned crosses on the lawns of Catholics and Jews. We had very few people of African descent here at that point. And so that was their selling point. They were anti-papist and anti-Jew. That was tolerated until 1924 when they burned the altar at the cathedral. It was at that point that the Irish police, some retired, some still part of the force, had a meeting with these gentlemen, explaining to them the facts of life. And the facts of life were that they were not wanted to hear anymore. At that point, I'm not exactly sure What words were used to persuade them? It was the last known existence of the Ku Klux Klan within the city of Burlington. Now, of those 10 officers, 6 were Catholic and 4 were Protestant, yet all were Irish. Because even the Protestant Irish felt that that was a travesty, that the cathedral could be burned. They may not like the Catholics, they may not agree with Mary, but they agreed with the Constitution of the United States that you had religious freedom here, something that they did not have in their own past. So for me, I see this trend has continued within the Burlington Police Force and within Burlington itself. We don't always agree. We don't always concur, but we do support one another. Now, a couple quick funny stories, not part of the slideshow, but what the heck, I'll throw them in. Getting back to that officer who dragged that gentleman up the main street. The main reason that he didn't wait for the paddy wagon was it was near the end of his shift. And his comment was, and this is not in the Free Press, but from personal recollections, "I'd rather face the devil himself than me wife if I don't get home for supper." So dragging a man that size was not as scary in any way as what he would face from his wife, who stood all of 4'10". Another funny story from the police department, and this is one that I heard at that warm-up shack on Roosevelt Field when I was just a lad, from the 3 men smoking cigars and laughing hilariously. It was probably 2 months into it before I realized these were retired police officers. And so I guess they decided they would continue the tradition of keeping young skaters warm. I also noticed that I stayed in longer, and they also continued the concept of the pint. When no one else was there, they would sip a little and keep warm from another form. And from them, I've learned many stories about the Irish within the Burlington Police. Probably the funniest story I've ever heard from them, and was confirmed by other people, was the infamous riot of 1917. UVM is a liberal institution, has been a liberal institution for a long time. In the War of 1812, they gathered in Old Mill around a keg of beer to discuss whether they should participate within the war. The next morning, when these students woke up, they decided perhaps they should. In 1917, it was slightly different. When we declared war and said that we were entering into World War I, 300 students marched down Main Street carrying a casket that said, "Democracy is dead." And they were going to bring it into the mayor's office and set it on fire. They were outmanned because at the bottom of Main Street were 2 Irish officers with their trinities. 30 seconds upon the entering of the conflict, the casket was on the ground, burning, and all 300 students were running back up the street to UVM, and nothing was ever heard again. And so the Irish had a way of looking at things slightly differently. The watch that I passed around, along with the bullets, was the watch that was granted to my grandfather when he retired from the police department. You notice that it's silver. The reason that it is silver is that they saw themselves not as aristocracy, not as elite, but servants. And a servant was only deserving of a silver watch, not a gold. And so for them, it was a sign of pride because someone said, "You have been a good and faithful servant." I wind up my talk with that. I'll answer any questions that are possible you might have to the best of my ability. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found some of the stories funny, some of the stories enlightening. Once again, the part of me that is of this generation shudders when I think of the policing that they did. But I realize that I have to make a judgment based upon the times that were. And so they were the most efficient and best for the times. Thank you very much for coming out, and I'll answer any questions you got. Yes?
You talked about the police officers being called to the saloons. What were the other kinds of incidences that would require the police? Stealing somebody's horse? How would that be covered?
They all seem to be related to the saloons. Most of the incidents that the Three Musketeers, as I used to call them at the warm-up shack, it was somebody would steal a horse because he was drunk and knew he couldn't walk home, or he wanted to prove he could ride it. Fist fights, obviously, prostitution, gambling. These were all incidences that occurred. I look at what the police force faces now, and I think they would be happy facing what my grandfather faced. The drugs that they now are dealing with and some of the violence that they have to deal with. There's only one officer that has ever been killed on duty in the city of Burlington. That was in 1904. He was shot 3 times by an Army deserter. Officer Miles, who was a real stalwart. If you get a chance to read Lieutenant Beckwourth's book, I highly recommend it. He talks about Officer Miles quite a lot. He was shot, survived with a bullet next to his spine, and finally died in 1924. He and my grandfather, once again, because I know the stories of my grandfather, I keep bringing him up, but he's more of an archetype than really, I'm not trying to make the Gormans look good. One of the things that they used to love doing for the kids was to take a silver dollar and bend it between their thumb and their forefinger. And then they would hand it to them and say, "If you can straighten it out, you can keep it." None of the kids could. But that gives you an idea of just how strong some of these gentlemen were. And yet they were facing people that were even stronger than that. And so one of the things that I learned, or one of the things that I've discovered through my research is there's nothing that is occurring now that didn't occur back then. I'm a ex-minister, retired minister. There's no new sin under the sun, really. And what happens now, happened then, perhaps on a slightly smaller scale, but we had less people. And there was a different set of source or sense of morality than we have now, I think. I'm not saying that's better or worse or anything, just it's different. But I look back and think about these guys and just marvel at what they faced. And what they faced, the Burlington Police Department faces in this day and age as well. Far too many crimes for far too many little officers. You know, I feel sorry for them. They are constantly at the straining point. Once again, I'm not an apologist for them. I'm just speaking as a citizen of Burlington. And with all that I've done in this world, there is no way I would ever want to be a police officer. I think that the task is too daunting, quite frankly. Any other questions?
I just really heartfelt appreciated the comment that you made about police officers seeing themselves as public servants. And it just made me feel that I wish that that was the way that people saw police officers, as servants wanting to help, wanting to improve, rather than as a group of people against them and wanting to create difficulty.
You know, the officers of today, I don't, fortunately, I have a lot of experience with them. I think that the ones that I've gotten to know over the years, through my various jobs, they would be extremely happy if they had to arrest no one, if there was an alternative to arrest, if there was a way that they could talk to them and convince them of doing something different. Unfortunately, in today's world, that doesn't seem to be the way things go anymore. But it's funny, you know, there's still tons of Irish within the Burlington Police Department. If you go to the fire department, I can think of 10 off the top of my head very quickly that are of Irish descent, so this has continued. We're considered a bastion of the Irish. When you look at it per capita, the state of Vermont has the third highest claim by people of Irish descent. And so the only places that are bigger than us are Illinois and Massachusetts. And we run a very, very, very close second to Illinois. Chicago and Boston being those two hubs. And part of that was the lumber industry and the railroads that were here. But the Irish just have been in part and parcel of this area. The Morgan House that I was showing you, some of the other names that I could throw out, like Contois Theater, the Corys. I mean, you could go on and on. That whole area, their names still continue within the city of Burlington. And because of what they did, and many times silently, they were honored with a name or of a building or something like that. And once again, I think a lot of them saw themselves as servants. There's the old joke that there are two Irish, a shanty and a lace curtain. But when push came to shove, they were all Irish. Questions? Yes?
Is there a particular neighborhood in Burlington where Irish families tended to live, as there were with Italian, Americans, Jewish residents, and other?
There are two areas that I can think of. One, there's Irish Alley over in Winooski. There was an Irish Alley there. There were a lot of Irishmen that were there. A lot of Irishmen right in the area next to the Italians. I mean, that was where those houses were and were ripped down in urban renewal. The Champlain Street, South Champlain Street area, that area was very high in Irish. The Follies, I mean, I could rattle off the names very quickly. And that's where the concentration was. But once again, I don't know if anybody had an opportunity to see a production that was done by public TV 2 years ago or 3 years ago called Little Jerusalem, which I thought was excellent. I would love to see somebody do that with the Irish at some point. They stayed clustered for a while, but then they moved out. And so there wasn't that sense of community, because for them, church provided community, fraternal orders provided community. There were a ton of Irishmen in the old Eagles Club. That was another place that I heard all these tales. And so that became their neighborhoods. And it's funny, if you go to Ireland, the pub is considered the working class country club. I've been over there multiple times. I've seen one drunken Irishman in all my trips. And that was because he had finally married off. his last daughter at the age of 40. And it had 3 drinks. Everybody else I saw were either from America or another part of Europe. What they do is they go in, they buy a pint, and that pint will go an hour and a half or 2 hours. And so for them, it's a place of conversation, a place of community. And that was replicated here in the United States through church and the fraternal orders and that. And you didn't, I brought up the Ku Klux Klan and the 10 officers in the sense to show you that here they had a sense of being Irish as opposed to being either Catholic or Protestant. That was just an area they agreed to disagree on. And so there was a unity there that you didn't see and with some of the other immigrant groups where there were a division like that. The only thing I can say to conclude is that obviously we're a festival that promotes Irish heritage. And I look at this and think of all the stories I could have told of things that the Irish did, but it was individuals, not sweeping programs that I think continue to this day. There were so many parallels within the Jewish community as I was looking at that program, Little Jerusalem. So many parallels that I saw between that and the Irish community. I was fortunate. I grew up on Ward Street, right between Archibald and Pomeroy. So those 3 synagogues, I could walk a half a block and I was there. Next to me was Joseph's of Joseph's Jewelry, a family who were the first that told me I should be proud of my heritage, the Irish heritage, even though they were Jewish. They had a baby grand piano in their front room. On the other side of me was a welfare family. And so it was this unique blend within that old community. And the Jews and the Irish, you will find, did not have many conflicts, especially when it came to the police, because they understood what it was like to come to a country and have prejudice against you just because of how you were born and because of your religious faith, if you weren't quite in the right pew, as they used to say. And so I see these parallels, and I see this cooperation between these dissident groups, what may appear as a dissident group from the outside. And I just, I look at my neighborhood. Across from me was Ben Black, who's famous for doing the sign that's now been transported to Ohavazedek. It was the Ark painted. But then I had a retired Irish fireman across the street from me, an Italian that had worked in the stone industry and retired to Burlington, Barry being too rough for him. And I could continue up. It was a combination of, as we used to call it, the UN, because we had a little bit of everything. French Canadians as well. And so I think that was one of the unique things I see about Burlington. Burlington has been a melting pot for many, many, many generations, and provides the vibrancy that we still see within this city today. So. Yes?
Were the police at the turn of the century, were they immigrants themselves, or were they the children of immigrants? So when did most?
It was a combination there of that 1913 police. For a long time, I thought that was the only picture they had of the Burlington Police Department. Today, while I was waiting for an officer to come out to talk to me, I actually found some more, which is kind of nice. Within all those officers, 11 of them were fresh off the boat, as it was said, and some were first generation born here in the United States. And so it was a combination. My grandfather, who was born here in the United States, still spoke with an Irish accent. still had a brogue as thick as you could possibly have, yet had never entered into Ireland. When I won the ticket back in '99, I went to see the Murray side of the family, and I was the first one to come back from the United States since 1905. And so it's interesting. It's a combination, you know, and the ones that were new got taken under the wing by the ones that had been here for a while and showed them the ropes. As I said, they stuck together.
Did they have that resentment against the British that came from the famine, or were they removed from that?
Well, there's one example I can give. In 1913, the police chief was half Irish and half English. And the way the men looked at him, he was an odd mongrel, but a good lad. And so I think there was some animosity there, but they still liked Chief Barber. And so they overlooked his shortcomings, shall we say. I know that there were many Irish who, I'll come up with a number, 7 that I know from stories, that when World War I came out and Ireland sided with Germany, they didn't actually participate, but they said, we'll support Germany. They tried to tell everybody with their thick brogues that they were French Canadian. And so I think that's a long way around to answering your question. Sure, I think that there was some dissatisfaction with the British, but it was more in the background than before. And yet, you know, Ireland to this day still has not recovered from the famine. They're still not up to the pre-famine population. Famine occurred in 1840. And so this country is still not recovered. Ireland is still not recovered if you look at it population-wise. And we're comparing 1840 numbers to 2016 numbers. So that population has never quite recovered. And yet, they're very grateful because America welcomed their rather strong backs. When you think of everything that was built here in the United States on the backs of the immigrants. I focus on the Irish right now, but the Italians, the French Canadians, they all had part and parcel of it. And so it is a unique setting for them, I think. And I think they were grateful and were able to forget because they were in a country where they had the freedoms that they so desired and could not have in their own country. No more questions. I want to thank you very much. I hope I wasn't too boring for you.